Hi, I'm Chris from Airwindows. I'm here with something else because I'm coming out with stuff on a weekly basis, as you know. I'm actually working on the concern of it being just lots of little things. I have an idea which might help with that. Namely, I could be doing a plugin that's kind of like monitoring, but for distortions. And we'll see how that goes. There's a number of irons in the fire. But what I'm bringing you today is something that's kind of like a follow-up. But it's not exactly an update because the things aren't quite the same. Remember Biquad? Biquad did stuff kind of like this. It's basically a filter. And you could crank it up and do this with it. But there's a problem, a number of problems actually. One of them is if you distort it, it's not nice. And another problem is this. Certain things that you do with it cause it to glitch out, and that's not great. People are running into problems with the biquad algorithm and having it say do this. It sort of broke. If you drop it too fast, it freaks out. There's also a concern, which is if you move it, it's not going smoothly. I mean, that might not be terribly obvious. But you can probably hear a certain amount of zipper noise going on there. And so I thought something I might try to do is go and redo biquad so that it recalculates every sample, which it doesn't currently do. What you've got there is essentially a technical experiment and a tool for doing a very simple, basic biquad type filtering in the Airwindows style with code around it to try to make it sound better. Trouble is, I started adding this smoothing and recalculating the factors on a sample by sample basis so that it can sweep more gradually and it wouldn't glitch out, and immediately ran into huge problems. Turns out you can't make biquad filters update that way. People have tried before. This is not a thing. You have to use different kinds of filters, perhaps filters that don't sound as nice, but that can update on a sample by sample basis and get swept and do radical things. But before I was done, I got busy with it and I came up with something that was as close as I could get to a biquad that was sweepable. And here's what I had to do. I had to slow the sweeping of it way down, and it's also sensitive to Q. It's sensitive to the resonance of the filter. I adjusted the loudness of it so you could crank up Q without having it automatically just distort like crazy, because the essential biquad that you get in the first biquad filter, if you boost the resonance like crazy, the volume just goes up. And that's not going to work for like synthy type sweeps and things. And I also had to change it in such a way where you can give it much sharper Q for what that's worth. And you can drop the Q down to 1. You can't drop the slope too far down because that just made it way more sensitive to glitching out. And as I kept trying to push it, I've limited the frequency a little bit as well. As I kept trying to push it, The glitching became more harsh and crazy, and I'll show you that. But I was able to sort of wrestle it into submission a little bit. So here's what we got. You'll see that it sort of swelled up. Maybe I can throw that other biquad in there strictly as a oh, no, I can't. Okay, we're going to take a moment and replace this with a gain control. I didn't really design this to go bonkers with the gain. It's designed to sort of ride the gain as you go, but it's still, like with this mastered style track, it's capable of pushing it too far. But as you can hear, even at the sharpest of bandwidths, and I have multiple types of filter as well, beware if you get too close to the top end with a really high Q, because it will glitch out. But you could be doing that on purpose for all I know. It's still kind of similar to the original biquad in the sense of it's tricky and problematic to do crazy stuff with. And again, if you sweep it up quickly from 0, that can sometimes cause a problem. Certainly if the Q is very low. There was a little thump there. But this is the kind of thing that you get if you're trying to sweep biquads, which are not supposed to be swept. So to get it a little bit more fluid than that, rather than trying to zip from one extreme to the other like that, which is going to give you problems, what you do is kind of ride these frequencies with whatever it is that you're doing with them. Like 1 is your low pass, it's a resonant low pass. I can put this back up to where you hear some of the clip because I've got it set up so that if you push too hard into it, it'll distort and it'll do a kind of averaging after the distort point. So you get sort of a grungy synth type filter. And that's a Q of 8, that's pretty sharp, but we can make it even sharper. Or indeed we can even just drive the filter externally. Anything sort of in the middle there should be pretty clear of freaking out and giving you artifacts. Although, you can do madness by cranking it beyond the point that's reasonable. Again, biquads are not meant to do this. If you change the filtering, if you change the constants of biquads in the middle of the sample loop, it'll do this. But I've decided to try to let you do it anyway, just in case that's the sort of thing that knocks you out. And again, that high frequency stuff was all about the really sharp Q. So for something like this, maybe you're going with a fairly flat Q. This is relatively normal sounding. Note that when I turn it on, it swept back up again. So bear that in mind. But once it's settled in, and it's finished chasing its frequencies and stuff, it sounds fairly normal. And you can do stuff like for instance, automate a frequency sweep. Or you might be doing it with the high pass. Just filtered everything out now. We'll throw in some resonance and there's another glitch right there. Again, biquads aren't supposed to do this. You're not supposed to be updating the coefficients of it every sample. But I needed to do it in order to get the fluidity. And that's also the reason why it's sweeping so slowly. Biquads flip out if you change their coefficients in the middle of the thing. There's two different uses that you can have. The first one is actually the first biquad filter, and it's using a configuration that takes a little less calculating to do. So it's more efficient, but it's even more likely to freak out with this kind of stuff. And this is a different formulation of it, which is moderately more capable of sweeping. As you can hear, and it's a nice sounding sweep. Even when being used on this completed track here. Here, let's throw it on some drums. That's a lot of Q. And we can turn it back up again. So we can get a certain amount of kind of analog smoothness and vibe out of this. Remember, we can freak it out by turning the Q really up high and then sweeping up to the high frequencies rapidly. Let's do that for fun. And then with less Q, it's more capable of doing that. Let's see what the threshold is. Still doing it without freaking out. Yeah, at this point it just wants to behave. It's interesting. The band passes are still behaving the way that the original biquad filter worked, because the band pass and the notch aren't subject to becoming overwhelmingly loud. Well, unless you do this to it. Sorry about that. No, not really sorry about that. I like doing that kind of stuff. But it's the high pass and low pass where the resonance can give you hugely loud results. You should never have to go all the way up to 50. I could have spared you that noise by not letting it go up to 50, but some people are going to want to do it, so sorry. And I should be able to sweep this up without it freaking out as long as I do it gently. Because if I hit frequency higher than 0.3, it will freak out. But, yep, there we go. We're good. So there you have it. A biquad filter that can be swept and freaked out with like it was a synthesizer filter. Granted, this is kind of a strange thing to do, and you have to be an audio DSP programmer to understand how silly this really is. Because normally if you're doing something with a sweepable crazy synth style filter, you're going to be using something like state variable that is simply done differently. And you're not going to be using a biquad, and you're certainly not going to be using the Airwindows biquad, which runs inside console to magnify any kind of the sort of harmonics and stuff that jumps out of, console will tend to magnify the freakouts. And so you could say this is the silliest thing I've ever done. Just possibly. But, I've done a whole variety of silly things. This one's not even being padded in the input. The idea is this should be able to work with normal recorded audio. But yeah, you know how this sort of thing works. I do have a smoothed output level in case you needed to automate that as well. What can I tell you? Again, I will try to keep developing stuff that's more approachable for people. That is one of the things that is in the works, is coming out with stuff like packages of plugins where people can jump right in and not have to dig through the pile, because by now the pile of plugins that I've put out there for free, supported by Patreon, is a very large pile. And I get how difficult that is. I'll do my best to work on that. Although it does seem kind of like, you're giving me too much free stuff. Ugh. But don't mind that. I know that it's really a concern. People have a hard time following this. I have a hard time following this sometimes. I was trying to come up with ideas for the many different kinds of distortions under one plugin, much like monitoring. And I missed lots of them. Stuff that I had done. Like from tape counts as a distortion because it doesn't have the head bump stuff. You're not going to get all of the head bump, every other EQ type thing in a distortion plugin. But from tape would count. I overlooked that. I overlooked high impact. High impact is a completely different kind of distortion. And it doesn't exist quite in any of the other ones. And it has its own distinct quality, and yet I overlooked it. So I'll work on getting everything together so that people can jump in and be able to try various other stuff out. Although I will always tend to put out sort of minimal plugins with just one algorithm when I develop new stuff and get that going. On that note, here you go. Biquad2 is the one that acts more like a synthesizer filter, even though biquad filters aren't supposed to act like a synthesizer filter. Like, trust me on this one. When I took Biquad1 and started updating the stuff on literally every sample so that it could sweep smoothly, it just freaked out instantly. The second you did anything with it, like updating with the zipper noise of updating on every buffer, which is how that works, is it's kind of like your latency. When you're updating plugins, very often you'll have controls putting information into the plugin, And the latency that you set also determines the buffer the plugin operates on. So if you're doing really, really fast latency, it'll be updating that control fairly quickly. Whereas if you do a really slow latency, just so that you don't have dropouts and so that your computer can handle everything, it's going to update some of the controls much more slowly unless they are smoothed. And this is something that Biquad does and Biquad2 does and Biquad doesn't. So on that note, it's kind of like I'm giving you a tool that's not supposed to be possible, because you're not supposed to use biquads in this way. And, well, I have. So if it happens that the sound of the Airwindows biquad filter is something that you would want in, say, a pad or something, and you'd want to be able to move it, you want to be able to sweep it, and you're willing to work with the limitations that that has, then Biquad2 is for you. It is free, and me working on this stuff and being able to bring it out, and being able to work on stuff like consolidating the distortion plugins into under one hood, that stuff is supported by Patreon. So without Patreon, I would have trouble digging into all the stuff that I want to dig into in audio, because it's not just plugins. I'd like to come up with, I could show you something that would blow your mind. I'm working on a Eurorack mixer that could also be used as, but that's another story for another day. At any rate, you have Biquad2 today, and I really appreciate the patronage people have done that have kept me doing this enough that now the number of plugins that I've given people for free is actually a problem. That's a nice kind of problem to have, at least if you're me. And I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.